There's one question that will reveal more than any other whether or not someone has moved from being a novice reader to a more mature reader. And it's not how many books they've read. It's not how much time they spend reading every day. It's not even whether or not they have a note-taking system for engaging with and remembering the things that they read. As important as those things are, there is just this single dividing line that many readers honestly never cross because they omit this one practice. And from this single activity, I think, come some of the most rewarding joys of the reading life. And that's why in this video, I want to show you what that practice is and why it matters so much and how you can get started with it. So to set things up, I think it'll be helpful to think about the different stages of the reading life, which I think are roughly analogous to the different stages that a fire goes through. If you picture building a fire in your backyard with logs and some lighter, drier twigs, when you start the fire, there's the ignition, there's a spark, and then there's a lot of light as those lighter, easier materials are burnt up. That's the first stage. And then it moves into a second stage where it begins to mature. This is what's called the growth stage for fires. And they're beginning to burn more materials, some of the deeper, more substantial materials. And so the fire is growing and becoming a little bit more stable. There may be a little bit less light, but there's more heat. Then it eventually moves into the third stage where it becomes a mature fire. And at that point, you have these deep burning coals that provide long-term heat. And this is something like what happens in our reading life. Perhaps there's some spark, something that inspires you to start reading or to start reading again. And as you do that, you are often reaching for some of the easier things to read and going through those, burning through those pretty quickly. And then you move into more of a growth stage where you're exploring different genres, perhaps, maybe some more substantial works, and realizing that it's worth going through some of those at a slower pace. And so instead of just burning through things as fast as you can read them, you begin to slow down on certain works and take your time and think and reflect on them more. And I think that's where most readers get stuck. Certainly many readers get stuck in the second stage. And the reason for that comes back to the question I mentioned at the beginning, this one question that divides readers. And that is, what books do you return to, or what books do you reread? For many readers today, the answer is virtually none. C.S. Lewis puts it very bluntly, the majority never read anything twice. The sure mark of an unliterary man is that he considers, I've read it already, to be a conclusive argument against reading a work. Those who read great works, on the other hand, will read the same work 10, 20, or 30 times during the course of their lifetime. In my experience, some people find this hard to believe at first because they think there are so many great books out there and our reading time is relatively or comparatively small. And so why would you waste that little bit of reading time that you have on books that you've already read instead of reading the many that are out there that you haven't gotten to yet? It feels like you're wasting your time or not using it as well as you could be. And I think this intuition is very understandable. It's very relatable, but it actually misses something really important. It assumes that books are like a plastic bottle of water. When you get thirsty, you drink it, and when you're done with it, you set it aside. Maybe you discard it. And then when you get thirsty again, you go and you find another plastic bottle of water, and you drink that one, and so on and so forth. And for a lot of books, honestly, this is roughly correct. They are good for a one-time drink. They refresh you, you're done with them, and it's time to move on to the next. But some books aren't like that at all. They're not like a plastic bottle of water. They are like a river of water. They are like a fresh mountain spring. And like that stream, they cannot be exhausted. You're not going to empty them by going and drinking from them one time. This reminds me of a famous quote from Heraclitus where he says, "A man never steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man." That's how it is with us and great books, and that's partly why it's such a mistake to treat them like they're just plastic water bottles that can be disposed of after one drink. And when you think about it, I think we all already know this because it's how we approach pretty much everything else in life. So think about your favorite song, for example. How many times have you listened to that song? Or imagine that you hear a song for the first time and you are blown away. You just think, this is one of the best songs I've ever listened to. And then you never listen to it again. And somebody asks, like, I thought you loved this song. You don't listen to it anymore? And you say, oh no, I can't listen to that again. There's so much music out there I've never listened to. How could I afford to spend that time re-listening to a song when there's so much music I haven't heard yet? And we clearly know this would be a mistake. And it's the same thing with food. It's the same thing with the places that we visit. Even with our friends, our friendships. Unless we are absolute slaves to novelty, we cherish those things that have delighted us in the past, and so we keep returning to them. And so one of the reasons that we keep listening to the same songs or eating the same food or going to the same places is just because we enjoy it so much. And there's another reason, though, that's a more practical one, which is that we know that those are sort of tried and true. I know that when I listen to that song, it's a 10 out of 10. Whereas if I listen to a song I've never heard before, it may be a 10 or it may be a 2. And so rationally, it actually makes a lot of sense that we're revisiting these things. And I think it makes sense that we would do the same thing with books. So I've got a stack of books right here. These are 10 of my favorite books. And I've got another stack of books that I've never read before. So here are 10 sort of wild cards, 10 books I've never read. Now, if I were to pick a book to reread from this stack, what are the chances that it's going to be just a 10 out of 10? It's pretty much 100%, right? And we could ask, well, if I were to pick a book out of this stack, even if it's a stack of books that have been recommended to me, a stack of books that I have good reason to think are going to be good books that I'll enjoy, the chances that any one of these is going to be a 10 out of 10 is actually pretty low. The chances that even one of these books will eventually end up in this stack over here is pretty low. And so if I'm wanting to read something that's going to really nourish me, that's going to be really enjoyable, actually picking out of this stack makes more sense. Now, I'm not suggesting that we spend all of our time rereading by any means, but you see the logic. It actually makes a lot of sense to revisit those books that we know are really good, instead of constantly only trying to go after new books that may be really good or may not be good for us at that time. Another key insight that I think readers who don't reread are missing is that great books get better the more that you read them. So when you read a book for the second time, this kind of book, it's better the second time than it was the first time. When you read it the third time, it's better than it was the second time, and so on, so on. And that's why Lewis says that those who read great books will go on to read some of them 10, 20, even 30 times in their lifetime. And so the line dividing stage 1 and 2 from stage 3 in reading, from becoming a genuinely mature reader, isn't, again, how many books you read or how much time you spend reading. It's actually whether or not you've come to understand that there are some books that you cannot exhaust by reading them just one time. It's understanding that there are some books that have this quality that make them like a stream, that the more you go back to them, the more refreshing they become. Another reason I think this is a distinct marker of a mature reader is that only the person who has read somewhat broadly and reflectively is even in a position to be able to accurately judge which books they should be rereading. And this is important because it really gets to why rereading is particularly appropriate for the third stage of the reading life, which means that the amount of rereading you do should actually increase over time. And this also means if you're somebody that's not rereading right now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're making a mistake or you're doing things wrong. It may just mean that you haven't read enough yet to be able to get a feel for those books that are worth going back to. Or maybe you've just started reading 6 months ago and enough time hasn't passed between the books that you started reading and when it would make sense to reread those. What I do think is really important is, even early on with reading, to understand that not all books are plastic bottles of water. To understand that there are great books that are like a stream that you should at some point begin returning to, even if it's not now, even if you're not quite ready for that yet. Whether you're someone who rereads now or not, I'm curious if you've ever come across a book and thought, I'm going to have to come back to this book later. What are some books that you think are worthwhile rereading? So let me know in the comments below, and while you're at it, go ahead and like this video if you're enjoying it. That helps me out a lot. It helps tell YouTube that I'm delivering valuable content. So I want to give some suggestions for rereading, but first let me sort of recap what are some of what I think are the key takeaways from the video so far. One is to remember that a 10-year-old shouldn't be expected to behave like a 30-year-old. So if your reading life is the equivalent of an adolescent, then don't try to force it into being an adult. Just let it grow. And the best thing to do while it's growing is to nourish it with great books. And if you do that, it will grow over time as it should. So let it progress and happen naturally instead of forcing it. The second thing is that there are books that you will enjoy reading more the second time than you did the first. And discovering which books those are and rereading them is one of the greatest rewards of the reading life. So don't get so caught up making new friends that you neglect your old friends. And if what I'm saying so far makes sense to you, if you found it valuable, there's a good chance you would make a great morning light reader. So be sure to subscribe to this channel before you finish watching. Now I want to get to some suggestions for rereading books. And the first is just a rule of thumb about letting some time pass in between the first time you read it and the second time. And the one exception to this would be if you're approaching a difficult book and you follow the advice of someone like Mortimer Adler and do a really quick read through the whole thing without stopping to try to understand everything or look anything up. You just read through it quick. And then are going to follow that up with a more analytic or careful reading, then it's certainly appropriate to do those just back to back. But if it's just a general read, something that you've read and want to come back to in the future, give it some time. Give yourself some time to grow Give yourself some time to read other books that will then come to color the way that you see it when you return to it, and so on. Typically, I would say roughly a year is a rule of thumb minimum that I would want to leave in between reading a book for the first time and the second time. The second recommendation would be not to force this, either in general, like I mentioned earlier, or with specific books. So let's just say you try to reread a certain book that you read before, you really enjoyed it the first time, you're excited about approaching it again, and you start rereading it, and it's just not clicking. For whatever reason, you feel like you are stepping back in the same river as the same person, and it's not particularly refreshing. Then set that book aside, and maybe in 5 years from now that'll change, or maybe you decide to not reread that book again. Maybe you misjudged it. And so it's totally fine to set aside a book, to stop reading it after a couple chapters if, as you reread, it's not what you expected. A third suggestion would be not to let someone else determine what you should reread. Now, obviously, suggestions from other people can be really helpful. Input from other people can be helpful, but ultimately, you have to figure out what's going to make sense for you to reread and when, because that does vary from person to person. And lastly, along those lines, it may be helpful, especially if you're someone who reads a lot, to have some sort of system for keeping up with the books that you've read once and want to return to in the future. This could be a notebook or a page or something on your computer, or even a shelf on your bookshelf where you keep the books that you thought were just so good you think you're going to want to come back to those again. And so you may have a shelf dedicated to that. But some system for keeping up with it so that you don't forget about some of those books, or so that they don't slip through the cracks if they really were worth coming back to. So I hope this video has helped shed light on the beauty of rereading books, while also sort of tempering that with the fact that it's not something that we need to rush into or force, but something that we can let happen naturally as long as we are attentive to what books are worthwhile revisiting.